I'm so happy to welcome the Reverend Ruth Boling to 30 Good Minutes as our 1998 Alfred P. Klausler Sermon Award winner. Her message is called Where the River Goes. Welcome, Ruth.
Thank you. In Ezekiel chapter 4, we will encounter a vision of the prophet spoken at a time when Jerusalem and her temple had been destroyed and God's people had been taken captive in Babylon. In this vision, Ezekiel is back in the temple somehow, and he's being given a very interesting tour. Then he brought me back to the door of the temple, and behold, water was issuing from below the threshold of the temple toward the east, for the temple faced east. And the water was flowing down from below the south end of the threshold of the temple, south of the altar. Then he brought me out by way of the north gate and led me round on the outside to the outer gate that faces toward the east, and the water was coming out on the south side. Going on eastward with a line in his hand, the man measured 1,000 cubits, and then led me through the water, and it was ankle deep. Again he measured 1,000 and led me through the water, and it was knee deep. Again he measured 1,000 and led me through the water, and it was waist deep. Again he measured 1,000, and it was a river that I could not pass through, for the water had risen. It was deep enough to swim in, a river that could not be passed through. And he said to me, "Mortal, have you seen this?" Then he led me back along the bank of the river, and as I went back, I saw upon the bank of the river very many trees on one side or the other. And he said to me, "This water flows toward the eastern region and goes down to the Arabah, and when it enters the stagnant waters of the sea, the water will become fresh. And wherever the river goes, every living creature will swarm with life, and there will be very many fish. For this water goes there, that the waters of the sea may become fresh. So everything lives where the river goes. And on the banks, on both sides of the river, there will grow all kinds of trees for fruit. Their leaves will not wither, nor their fruit fail, but they will bear fresh fruit every month, because the water for them flows from the sanctuary. Their fruit will be for food, and their leaves for healing." This is the word of God. While pastoring a church in New Hampshire, I spent a week every summer directing a camp for junior-aged children. Each year, the campers and I looked forward to what had become our all-time favorite thing to do together. On that day, the best thing to wear was your swimsuit, a big shirt, and a pair of old sneakers. What happened was we'd walk down the road a mile or so to a certain spot where we'd clamber down the steep bank to the edge of a creek, and in we'd go. It was the creek walk. At first we'd squeal because the water was cold. Our wet sneakers made our feet feel like they weighed 25 pounds each. But soon we'd learn to steady ourselves in the current, and then off we'd go, ankle deep, knee deep, even waist deep, discovering moss, grass, fish, dragonflies, helping a friend jump from one rock to another, waiting for someone to catch up, splashing each other, and all the while the shushing sound of the creek in our ears, running down our necks, our backs, soothing, chuckling, murmuring ancient truths that we could almost make out, that we thought we might have remembered from of old. It seems to me that life in the Spirit is kind of like a continuous creek walk. We in our various faith communities take a kind of creek walk pilgrimage together, moving forward downstream through time and change, through birth and youth, midlife and old age, learning and laughing together, slipping, falling, and regaining our balance again, helping one another at times, and always with an eye to the wonder and beauty of it all, and always with a natural instinct to praise God who made us. And so I love Ezekiel's vision of a healing river flowing right out of the temple through the streets of Jerusalem. And over the years, I've come to see that image of the healing river as a vision for how God acts through the church to give life to the world. So let's take a closer look at the biblical text. Ezekiel strikes me as a 6th century BC Martin Luther King Jr. He was speaking to a people who were every bit as disenfranchised as the African American of the 1960s. His audience was Israel in exile, a refugee people eking out a marginal existence in Babylon and singing homesick songs of Zion in the quiet of the night. What does a prophet say to his kinsfolk at such a time as that? A prophet says, I have a dream. I have a dream of Jerusalem restored, says Ezekiel. And I have a dream that all 12 tribes of Israel live together again in the land that stretches around Jerusalem. I have a dream, says Ezekiel, of our glorious temple rebuilt and reconsecrated. I have a dream that God lives in our temple, and I dream that God causes a great river to flow from the temple out, down, to irrigate our deserts and our waste places, so that all around us an oasis blooms. Trees produce abundant food and leaves for healing, and there will be very many fish, says Ezekiel. I have a dream today. I said earlier that I like to think of life in the Spirit as a kind of continuous creek walk. But that analogy only goes so far. Things don't automatically go along swimmingly for us just because we happen to be people of faith. You know that. That's reality. Ezekiel's dream survives for us today as a vision for our day because it accounts for reality. It was and it is God's answer to the sound of weeping and the fury of broken dreams. And it's a dream especially for exiles, for people who feel cut off from the life-giving presence of God. I have been in exile. My life in the Spirit stopped being a creek walk a few years ago and became more like a continuous running and ducking for cover. On December 13th, 1994, the phone rang, waking me from a sound sleep. It was my sister Martha. She was crying. She told me that our parents had both been killed the day before in a car accident, a head-on collision. My husband Carlos and I boarded a plane to Chicago that afternoon to be with family and plan the funeral. Unbeknownst to us, that plane ride was to be the first of many, for in the course of that terrible, terrible year, we also grieved the deaths of my grandmother, my aunt, my sister-in-law, and the phone call that announced the sudden death of my husband's father the following New Year's Eve seemed like the last straw. But it wasn't, because you see, all of that had happened the same year that Carlos and I had had a series of disheartening doctor's appointments that left us with the mind-numbing diagnosis, severe infertility. In all likelihood, we were told we would never have children of our own. So there I was, cut off, it seemed, from before and from behind, robbed of my past, and robbed of my future as I had imagined it. I was the associate pastor of a church at that time, and I found myself asking, where's the healing river now? And I found myself afraid afraid of the very God whose power it was to make me whole. What would God do to me next, I wondered. So I took a leave of absence from my church, and it helped during those days to have someone to sit with, someone who listened to me and then said to me in one way or another and over again, "Yes, I can see how this must be for you, Ruth. And I know you can't see beyond here just now, but I believe I can, and I believe there is hope. Do you trust me?" A turning point came for me on another December night. Our church had a tradition of hosting a living nativity pageant for the entire town. And Carlos and I had slipped out of our house to join the crowd following Mary and Joseph in a kind of procession leading from the church steps down the road to the barn attached to the church manse. Now, in order to understand this story, you need to know another little story. When I was an infant in my bassinet, my older sister Gail saw so many people walk by, stop, look inside and say, "Hi, Ruth," that she thought my name was Hi, Ruth. Well, after a long wait in the manse driveway, we finally arrived at the front of the line and stood before that splendid tableau of Mary and Joseph, shepherds and real sheep, the three kings and baby Jesus, and a ladder of little angels extending up the barn steps to heaven. Yes, here it is, I thought with satisfaction, our annual enactment of how Jesus came to be with us on earth. And I smiled to see familiar faces in the tableau. And suddenly I heard a small voice. The voice said, "Hi, Ruth." I scanned the faces to see who said it, but I never found out because then I heard it again, but from somewhere else. "Hi, Ruth." And again, "Hi, Ruth." A low murmuring of "Hi, Ruths" ensued, and I saw little hands waving and small faces lighting up in smiles. And I even got a wink and a "Hi, Ruth" from one of the stately kings. In something of a daze, I tore myself away. Carlos and I cut through the streams of people back to our home, where I broke down and wept. God, the one I had been afraid of, had come to me on that dark night. God, the one I had been afraid of, had spoken to me through the mouths of children, shepherds' waves, and the wink of a king. And what God had said was simply, "Hi, Ruth." God also seemed to say, "I am in the world, and my people are in the world, and this stream of pilgrims flowing toward the stable and the warm pool of light that marks my presence in the world, this is a healing river for you. Yes, you. Come, wade in the water. Let the children splash you with their Hi, Ruths." God also seemed to say, "I am in the world, and you are in the world, and I know you by name, even by your secret name. Isn't that enough?" It was. That night marked the beginning of the end of my exile. My life has changed a lot since that December day. The details are not important. What is important is that slowly, slowly, I grew to trust God once more. Ezekiel sat with God's people in Babylon day after day, week after week, listening to them and then saying to them in so many words and over again, "Perhaps you can't see beyond here just now, but I believe I can, and I believe there is hope. Do you trust me?" I wonder who you will turn to when you are in exile, when you find yourself cut off from the life-giving presence of God. Will it be a friend, a counselor, a dream, the scriptures? What about the church? I dream of our churches being filled with exiles. I dream of us turning to each other and saying, "Hi," and offering words of compassionate hope. And I know that because of God's irrepressible presence in the world, exile is always temporary. It may be prolonged, but it won't last forever. And if you've been baptized, then your baptism is your surest sign of this hope of which I speak. For by it you know that if anybody asks you who you are, or if anything causes you to question who you are or why you are, or if the meaning of absolutely everything seems to bottom out, you can still find it within yourself to say that you are a child of God. And if a child of God, then vulnerable to the dreams that come from God, and homesick for the presence of God and the company of God's people, thirsty for the water of God and aching for God's healing. If I were you, I'd wear your rubber boots to church from now on. Because I have this idea that someday, maybe soon, all the baptismal fonts in the front of all of our churches all around our land will start a gurgling and a bubbling, and there will be, ankle deep in living water, heading downstream, out the door, down the front steps. And you'll be in the river because you are the river. You, a swirl or a splash or a molecule of goodness in the river that heals life. Ezekiel says, everything will live where the river goes. I say, perhaps you can't see that just now, but I believe I can, and I believe there is hope. Do you trust me?